When the DNA results came back, Angel didn't cry. She laughed, because this billionaire CEO, standing in his designer suit, demanding to know how long she'd manipulated his dying father, had no idea he was the reason her daughter grew up without a father. One phone call 17 years ago. That's all it took for Robert Stevens to destroy the future his own son was driving back to claim. His son, Elizabeth's father. The man who died on a highway in the rain, racing toward the woman he loved, while his family convinced him she wasn't worth the empire he'd inherit. And now, Robert's father, the one supposedly losing his mind to dementia, recognized Angel's 16-year-old daughter the second she walked through the door, called her my little star, knew her middle name that no one ever used, hummed lullabies that had skipped a generation. Gary Stevens's broken brain saw what his son's whole one couldn't, that sometimes family isn't about what we remember. It's about what our hearts refuse to forget. And Robert was about to learn that the caregiver he'd hired to comfort his father through his final days, she was the ghost that should have been his daughter-in-law. And her daughter, the one Robert assumed, was just the help's kid. She was about to inherit everything he thought belonged only to him. The dying man called her by a name she'd never told him. Angel Reyes froze in the doorway of the private hospital suite, medication tray trembling in her hands. The afternoon sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across imported marble floors that cost more than most people's houses. But Angel wasn't seeing the opulence. She was staring at Gary Stevens, 83 years old, billionaire patriarch, dementia patient, reaching toward her daughter with tears streaming down his weathered face. "My little star," he whispered, his voice worn smooth by age and illness. "You came back." Elizabeth stood at the edge of his hospital bed, her dark curls tied back in that careful, neat way she'd perfected over 16 years of growing up too fast. Her posture was perfect, cautious, the posture of a child who learned early that the world doesn't bend for you, you bend for it. She looked at Gary with confusion flickering across her face, but also something else, something softer, kindness, the kind you can't teach, the kind that either lives in someone or it doesn't. "Come closer," Gary said, his gnarled hand extending. "You always did like to stand too far away." Angel's breath caught in her throat. Elizabeth, Estelle, French for star. The middle name Angel's mother had given her daughter in a county hospital 16 years ago, while Angel was still recovering from labor. A name they never used. A name Elizabeth's school records didn't have. A name that existed only on a birth certificate buried in a lockbox Angel kept under her bed. There was no possible way Gary Stevens could know it. Yet somehow, he did. Angel forced a smile, the professional kind she'd perfected over years of caregiving, and adjusted the IV pole instead of answering the question screaming in her mind. Her hands moved on autopilot. Check the drip rate. Note the fluid levels. Pretend everything is normal when nothing about this is normal. Gary Stevens had been declining for months. Dementia, the doctor said. Advanced stage. Some days he knew exactly who he was. Captain of industry, builder of empires, the kind of man whose name opened doors and closed deals. Some days he thought it was 1987 and kept asking for his wife, Margaret, who'd been dead for 12 years. And lately, on too many days, he believed Elizabeth was his daughter. Angel had tried to correct him at first, gently, professionally. "Mr. Stevens, this is Elizabeth, my daughter. She's here helping me today." He'd looked at Angel with such profound confusion, such deep hurt, that it felt cruel. "No," he'd said, his voice breaking. "No, That's my girl. That's my little star. Why are you saying she's not mine? He'd cried then. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a man who'd buried his wife and built a fortune. The broken, childlike tears of someone whose reality was being torn away. Angel stopped correcting him after that. Peace, she'd decided, mattered more than truth. Or so she'd thought. Robert Stevens arrived late that afternoon, as he always did, moving through the private care wing of Stevens Memorial Hospital, like a man who owned everything except time. His suit was flawless. Charcoal gray, probably Italian, probably worth more than Angel made in 3 months. His expression wasn't flawless, though. It was tight, controlled. The face of someone holding back an ocean behind a dam. He paused just outside the door when he heard something he hadn't heard in months. His father laughing. Not the polite chuckle of social obligation. Real laughter. The kind that shakes your shoulders and makes your eyes crinkle at the corners. "You came back," Gary said warmly from the bed, his voice suddenly stronger. "I told Robert you would. I told him you'd come back to us." Robert stepped into the room. Angel felt the moment shift before she turned. The air pressure changed. The temperature dropped. Or maybe that was just her body recognizing danger before her mind could name it. Gary was looking past her, through her, at Robert. "She has your eyes," Gary continued, still smiling at Elizabeth but speaking to his son, just like her mother did. Margaret always said the eyes would tell the truth. Silence fell heavy. Elizabeth looked from Gary to Robert, confusion flickering across her young face. She'd been working as Angel's assistant for 2 weeks now, helping with the easier tasks, bringing comfort to a dying man. She was good at it. Natural. She had a gift for making people feel seen. But right now, she looked lost. "Sir?" Elizabeth asked softly, her voice uncertain. "I'm not—" "It's okay," Angel interrupted, her voice steady by sheer force of will. "He's tired. The medication makes him confused sometimes." Robert's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from his father to Elizabeth to Angel. There was something in that look, something calculating, something that made Angel want to grab her daughter and run. This wasn't the first time Gary had called Elizabeth his daughter, but it was the first time it happened in front of Robert Stevens, and that changed everything. Angel had been hired as Gary's live-in caregiver 6 weeks ago, after his condition worsened, and the rotating day shift nurses weren't enough anymore. She'd been recommended by Lori, a nurse supervisor Angel had worked with years ago, someone who trusted her with the difficult patients, the ones other caregivers whispered about in break rooms, the ones who needed more than medical care. They needed someone who wouldn't flinch at the hard moments. Angel never flinched. She needed the money. More than that, she needed stability. The kind of stability that came with a private suite in a billionaire's home, with meals provided and a salary that meant Elizabeth could finally think about college without the weight of student loans crushing her future before it started. Elizabeth had grown up in hospitals and quiet apartments, in waiting rooms and bus stations, in the spaces between Angel's shifts. She'd learned to do homework in break rooms and sleep through the sound of medical equipment. She'd learned that survival required flexibility and silence. They never talked about Elizabeth's father. There were no pictures, no stories. Just a blank space Angel had sealed so tightly, she'd almost convinced herself it no longer existed. Almost. Until Gary Stevens. Gary, who reached for Elizabeth's hand every morning when she brought his breakfast. Gary, who sang half-remembered lullabies when she adjusted his pillows. Gary, who looked at this teenage girl he'd known for 2 weeks and saw something the rest of the world couldn't. "She used to sing to me," Gary told Maria one evening. Maria was one of the night nurses, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands who'd been with the Stevens family for over a decade. My girl. She'd hum when she thought no one was listening. Angel had been standing in the doorway, about to bring Gary his evening medication. She froze, because Elizabeth did hum, unconsciously, usually when she was concentrating. A melody with no words, just a pattern of notes she'd repeat without realizing. Angel had always assumed it was something Elizabeth picked up from a classmate or heard on the radio. But standing there, watching Gary's face soften with a memory he shouldn't have, Angel felt something cold settle in her stomach. The feeling that the past she'd buried wasn't buried at all. It was standing in this room, wearing her daughter's face, humming a melody that belonged to ghosts. Robert confronted her 3 days later, not with anger. That would have been easier. With something worse. Quiet certainty. "How long have you known?" he asked. It was late, past midnight. Elizabeth was asleep in the caregiver's quarters, a converted guest room on the second floor, with its own bathroom and a window that overlooked gardens. Elizabeth said, looked like something from a movie. Angel was in Gary's office, updating his medical charts. Robert stood in the doorway, still wearing his suit from whatever 14-hour workday he'd just finished. He looked exhausted. Not physically, existentially. Angel didn't pretend not to understand. "I haven't," she said quietly, setting down her pen. "Not the way you think." Robert studied her face. Really studied it. The kind of look that catalogs details. The exhaustion in the lines around her eyes. The restraint in the set of her jaw. The practiced calm that came from years of holding everything together with nothing but will. "You let him believe she's his daughter," Robert said. Not an accusation, an observation. "I let him be at peace," Angel replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "There's a difference." Robert exhaled sharply. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. The click of the lock felt final. "You understand how this looks," he said. Angel stood. She was shorter than him by several inches, but she didn't back down. "I understand how it feels to grow up without answers," she said. "I understand how it feels to be 16 and wonder why half of you is missing. I understand how it feels to survive instead of live. So, yes, Mr. Stevens, I understand exactly how this looks, and I'm telling you, I don't know why your father thinks Elizabeth is his daughter, but I'm not going to destroy his last moments of peace by forcing reality on a mind that can't hold it anymore." Something shifted in Robert's expression. Not softening, but something. Recognition, maybe, or respect. "The test is scheduled for tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "A DNA test, medical protocol for his treatment plan." That was a lie. They both knew it. Angel felt her heart kick against her ribs. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll make it a condition of your employment," Robert said. "I don't want to do that, but I will." Angel looked at him for a long moment. At this man who'd inherited empires, but looked like he'd lost something more valuable. At this son who visited his dying father out of duty and left looking more alone than when he'd arrived. "Fine," Angel said. "But Elizabeth doesn't know. Not yet. Not until we have answers." Robert nodded once. Then he left. Angel sank back into the chair, her hands shaking now that she was alone. She'd known this was coming. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep, in the place where mothers keep their worst fears, she'd known. Known that you can't outrun the past. Known that secrets don't disappear just because you stop speaking them aloud. Known that Gary Stevens wasn't confused. He was remembering something. The question was, what? That night, after checking on Elizabeth one last time, Angel stood in front of the bathroom mirror, in her own quarters. She studied her face. Then she thought about Elizabeth's face, the curve of the jaw, the deep-set eyes, the way Elizabeth tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she laughed, throwing it out freely like joy, was something you could afford to waste. Angel had spent 16 years telling herself Elizabeth looked like her grandmother, her mother's mother, a woman who died when Angel was 7, whose face existed only in one faded photograph Angel kept in her wallet. It was easier that way, safer, to give Elizabeth a history that didn't include questions about fathers who disappeared and summers that destroyed everything. But standing here now, in this suite, in this life she'd built on silence, Angel let herself do something she hadn't done in 17 years. She let herself remember. The summer of 2008. The beach in Maine. The boy who called himself Rob. The boy with kind eyes and a laugh that felt like freedom. The boy who'd held her face in his hands and promised forever. The boy who'd disappeared without a word, leaving behind only a watch with a timestamp frozen at 6:47 a.m. and a heart that Angel thought would never heal. She'd been 19, working at a coastal resort to save money for college, planning a future that felt solid and real. Then she met him. Then she loved him. Then he left. And 3 months later, when Angel realized she was pregnant, she made a choice. She disappeared too. New city, new name, new life. Alma Rodriguez became Angel Reyes. The girl who believed him forever became the woman who knew better. But now, standing in this bathroom, Angel felt the weight of that choice pressing down on her chest, like a physical thing. Because if Gary Stevens recognized Elizabeth, if this DNA test showed what Angel was suddenly, terrifyingly sure it would show, then the boy from that summer wasn't just some nobody who'd broken her heart. He was connected to this family, this empire, this dying man who looked at Elizabeth and saw blood. Angel closed her eyes. Tomorrow the test would happen. Tomorrow they'd take a sample from Elizabeth's cheek. Just a quick swab, routine medical protocol, nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Tomorrow the lab would process it. Tomorrow the truth would stop being something Angel could run from. And somewhere in this massive house, Gary Stevens slept peacefully, dreaming of his little star, the great-granddaughter he'd been waiting for, the one who'd finally come home. 17 years earlier, Angel had a different name and a completely different life. Her name was Alma Rodriguez then, 19 years old, full of the kind of hope that only exists before the world teaches you better. She was working at the Lighthouse Point Resort in coastal Maine, one of those sprawling properties where wealthy families came to pretend they were rustic, while staying in rooms that cost more per night than Alma made in a week. She didn't mind. The work was honest. The tips were good. And for the first time in her life, she was building something that belonged to her alone. She'd saved almost $3,000 by mid-June. Enough for her first semester at community college. Enough to start the future she'd been planning since she was 14 and realized no one else was going to build it for her. Then she met him. It was June 14th, 2008, a Thursday. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in New England summers, sharp and clean, like someone had scrubbed it. Alma was clearing tables on the resort's oceanside terrace when she heard laughter coming from the beach below. Not polite resort laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes from your stomach and doesn't care who's listening. She looked down. A man was standing at the edge of the water, jeans rolled up to his knees, trying to skip stones across the waves. He was terrible at it. Each stone plunked straight down. But he kept trying, and every failed attempt made him laugh harder. "You're doing it wrong," Alma called down before she could stop herself. He looked up. Even from a distance, She could see his smile. Open. Unguarded. Nothing calculated about it. Then come show me how it's done, he called back. She shouldn't have. She was on shift. She had 4 more tables to clear, and the lunch rush was coming. But something about that moment, the blue sky, the sound of waves, the way he was looking at her like she was someone worth knowing, made her set down her tray and walk down the wooden stairs to the beach. His name was Rob. Just Rob. No last name offered. No background volunteered. He was spending the summer figuring things out before real life started. He had kind eyes. Brown, almost amber in the sunlight. Hands that hadn't done much manual labor, but weren't soft either. You from around here? He asked, watching as Alma sent a stone skipping perfectly across the water. 4 bounces before it sank. No one's from around here, Alma said. This is where people come to escape from wherever they're from. Smart, he said. What are you escaping? She looked at him then. Really looked. At the expensive watch on his wrist he kept forgetting to hide. At the way he stood, like someone used to people listening when he spoke. At the sadness underneath the smile. Nothing yet, she said, but ask me again at the end of the summer. That summer would cost her everything. And she still didn't know the half of it. They fell into each other the way only young people can. Completely, recklessly, with no thought for consequences. Rob would meet her after her shifts. They'd walk the rocky shoreline, the lighthouse blinking in the distance, and he'd tell her things he said he'd never told anyone. About feeling trapped. About a father who saw him as a business asset instead of a son. About dreams he wasn't allowed to have. Alma told him things too. About growing up with nothing. About working since she was 15. About wanting a life that was hers, not handed down or borrowed. You're the freest person I've ever met, Rob said one night in late July. They were sitting on the beach, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. You know that? I'm a waitress living in staff housing, Alma laughed. That's not free, that's broke. No, he said seriously. Free is when you're building something for yourself. When you're not performing for anyone. You're free, Alma. And I think you might be saving me. The man she met that summer wasn't who he said he was. But Alma didn't know that then. All she knew was that when Rob kissed her, really kissed her, on August 2nd, under stars so bright they looked fake, it felt like finally arriving somewhere she'd been traveling toward her whole life. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. But I love you. And after this summer, I'm going to figure out how to make this real. A real life. With you. Promise, Alma asked, knowing she shouldn't believe him, but believing anyway. Promise, he said. And he'd meant it. She was sure he'd meant it. August 29th, 2008. 6:47 a.m. Alma woke up in Rob's hotel room, one of the luxury suites he'd been staying in all summer. They'd spent the night talking about the future, making plans. He was going to tell his father, stand up to him, choose his own life, their life. Alma had fallen asleep, feeling like the universe had finally decided she deserved something good. She woke up alone. The sheets were still warm where he'd been. His scent, something expensive and cedar, still clung to the pillows. But Rob was gone. His clothes, his suitcase, everything. Gone. Except for one thing. His watch. It sat on the nightstand, the leather strap curled like a discarded skin. The face was frozen. Battery dead. Timestamp, 6:47 a.m. Alma picked it up with shaking hands, turned it over, read the engraving on the back. To James with pride. Dad, James. Not Rob. Her stomach dropped. She waited 3 days, called the front desk. They said Mr. Stevens had checked out early that morning. No forwarding address. No message. Mr. Stevens. Alma felt the world tilt. She told herself it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. He'd come back. He'd explain. He loved her. He'd promised. But weeks passed. Then a month. Her calls went unanswered. The resort manager told her to stop bothering guests. She finally stopped trying. October 2008. Alma was 20 years old, throwing up in a gas station bathroom in Portland, staring at a positive pregnancy test she'd bought with the last $8 in her wallet. She called Rob's number one more time. It was disconnected. That's when she made her choice. If he could disappear, so could she. Alma Rodriguez died that winter. She drained her savings account, left Maine, and became Angel Reyes in Philadelphia. New name. New social security number. The kind you can buy if you know the right people, and you're desperate enough. New life built on the ashes of the old one. She worked temp jobs until she was too pregnant to hide it. Then she worked from home until she couldn't anymore. Then she had Elizabeth, February 12th, 2009. County Hospital. No father listed on the birth certificate. No family in the waiting room. Just Angel and a nurse named Patricia, who held her hand and said, "You're going to be okay, honey. You're stronger than you think." Angel wasn't looking for revenge or money. She just wanted to keep her daughter safe. That's all she'd ever wanted. To protect Elizabeth from the kind of hurt she'd endured. He'd held her face in his hands and promised forever. Then he'd walked away like she'd been a summer hobby. Angel had learned something that summer that shaped how she raised Elizabeth. People with power rarely face consequences for the hearts they break. The world doesn't always give us justice. Sometimes we have to create our own peace. If you've ever had to rebuild after someone powerful walked away, you understand what I mean. This story isn't just Angel's. It's about every woman who's had to be both mother and father, both broken and strong. Stay with us. You'll want to see where this goes. And if this resonates with you, subscribe, because these are the stories that need to be told. Now let's get back to the present. Because while Angel was remembering that summer, something was happening in Gary's room that would change everything. Elizabeth sat beside Gary's bed, reading aloud from a library book she'd brought, some mystery novel about family secrets. The afternoon light poured through the windows, turning everything golden. Gary wasn't following the words. He was watching Elizabeth's face, the way she tilted her head when she read, the way her fingers traced the page. "You have his stubbornness," Gary said suddenly, his voice clear in a way it hadn't been all week. "Your father's. James never could sit still either. Always moving, always thinking. Drove me crazy when he was young." Elizabeth stopped reading. She looked up, smiling politely the way she did when Gary's mind wandered. "I think you're mixing me up with someone else, Mr. Stevens," she said gently. But Gary shook his head. His eyes were sharp, focused, more present than they'd been in weeks. "No," he said firmly, reaching for her hand. "I'd know my great-granddaughter anywhere." Elizabeth's smile faltered. Down the hall, Angel's phone buzzed. A text from Robert Stevens. "Lab confirmed. Test scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Please have Elizabeth ready." The past was done running, and tomorrow the truth would finally catch up. Robert Stevens arrived at his father's bedside expecting to discuss estate planning. Instead, he walked into a scene that would haunt him. He stood in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, tie loosened after another 16-hour day of board meetings and merger negotiations. The kind of day that built empires and destroyed marriages. Robert had sacrificed both for days like these. He told himself it was worth it. But standing there, watching his father, he felt the lie crack open. Gary was laughing, really laughing, his whole body shaking with it, eyes bright in a way Robert hadn't seen in years, maybe decades. Elizabeth sat beside the bed, telling some story about a mishap at the grocery store, her hands gesturing wildly, and Gary was eating it up like she was performing Shakespeare. "And then the watermelons just started rolling," Elizabeth said, barely containing her own laughter. "All 12 of them, down the entire aisle. People were diving out of the way like it was some kind of fruit avalanche." Gary wheezed with laughter. "Your father," he started, then caught his breath. "James used to do things like that. Chaos followed that boy like a shadow." Robert's chest tightened. His father never talked about James. Not anymore. Not since the accident in 2010 that had taken his only grandson. The grief had turned Gary silent on the subject, like speaking the name would make the loss more real. But here he was, saying it easily, fondly, to this girl he'd known for weeks. Elizabeth smiled, clearly thinking Gary was confused again. "Sounds like he was fun." "He was," Gary said softly. Then he looked at her with such clarity, it made Robert's breath catch. "And you're just like him, stubborn, kind, too brave for your own good." Robert stepped into the room before he could stop himself. Angel noticed him first. He saw her spine straighten, her professional mask slide into place. But underneath it, he saw something else. Tension, maybe fear. "Mr. Stevens," she said, standing, "I didn't hear you come in. I was just about to take Elizabeth down for dinner." "Stay," Robert said. The word came out harder than he meant. He cleared his throat. "Please, I'd like to speak with you both about my father's care." It was a lie. He wanted to watch them, study them, figure out why looking at Elizabeth made something in his chest ache like an old wound reopening. Angel and Robert's first real conversation happened later that evening, after Elizabeth had gone to her quarters. They stood in Gary's private office, the one he'd used before the dementia took his ability to work. Robert had kept it exactly as his father left it, a museum to a man who was still breathing but already gone. "How long have you been doing this?" Robert asked, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch he didn't want, but needed something to do with his hands. "Caregiving? 12 years, Angel said. She stood near the door, ready to run. "Since Elizabeth was 4. That's young, to be a single mother and working full-time." Angel's jaw tightened. "You do what you have to do." Robert studied her over the rim of his glass. She was beautiful, in a way he was just now noticing. Not the polished beauty of the women in his social circle, but something real, earned. There was something familiar about her face, the way she held herself, like a memory he couldn't quite reach. "Have we met before?" he asked suddenly. "No," Angel said too quickly. "I'd remember meeting someone like you." Someone like you. The phrase carried weight, judgment maybe, or just acknowledgement of the chasm between their worlds. "My father seems very attached to Elizabeth," Robert said, changing tactics. "Unusually so. She's good with patients who have dementia. She doesn't try to force them into reality. She meets them where they are." "And where does my father think she is?" Angel met his eyes. "I think you know the answer to that, Mr. Stevens." Robert did know. His father thought Elizabeth was his daughter, which was impossible. Gary had only had one child, Robert himself, and Robert's only child had been James. James. The memory hit him like a fist. Summer 2008. James had been 21, restless, angry at being groomed for a life he hadn't chosen. Robert and his father had sent him to Maine to clear his head before starting his MBA, before stepping into his role in the family business. "Get it out of your system," they'd said. "Have your adventure. Then come home and be serious." James had called once that summer, just once. His voice had been different, lighter. "Dad, I met someone," he'd said. "Her name is Alma. She's different from anyone I've ever known. Real, you know? I think I might stay here longer." I think I might. Robert had cut him off. You have responsibilities, James. You start business school in 6 weeks. This girl, whoever she is, she's a summer distraction. Come home. There'd been silence on the line. Then, yeah, okay, Dad. James had come home 3 days later. He never mentioned Alma again, and 2 years later, he was dead. Car accident on a rainy highway. Gone at 23, taking with him every unfinished conversation, every road not taken. Robert had made one phone call back then. One. When James wouldn't stop asking about that girl from Maine, Robert had called the resort himself, left a message that James Stevens would not be returning, that any personal effects should be forwarded to their New York office. When Angel didn't answer, Robert told himself it was for the best. His son had a company to run. Responsibilities. He never asked himself what responsibilities she might have been facing. Alone. 3 days after that conversation in the office, Robert did something he hadn't done in years. He made a call to a private investigator. I need a background check, he said. Complete history. Angel Reyes, employed as my father's caregiver. The report came back 48 hours later. Robert opened it at 2:17 a.m. in his home office, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about the way Elizabeth tilted her head when she laughed. Angel Reyes first appeared in Philadelphia records 16 years ago. Social Security number issued 2009. No records before that. Employment history starting 2010. Clean background. Single mother. One daughter, Elizabeth Marie Reyes, born February 12, 2009. Robert's hands started shaking. Alma Rodriguez. Last known address, Lighthouse Point Resort, Maine. Employment terminated August 2008. No forwarding address. All databases checked. No records after that date. Effectively vanished. Same summer, same age. The math was impossible to ignore. What Robert found in that background check would make him question everything. He pulled up his calendar from 2008. Found the dates James had been in Maine, June through August. Found the date James came home, August 29th, Elizabeth's birthday, February 12th, 2009. Count back 9 months from February. May, early May. Close enough. Robert's breath came shallow. He pulled up a photo on his computer. One of the few he had of James from that summer. His son standing on a beach, smiling at the camera. Happy in a way Robert had rarely seen him. Then he looked at the surveillance photo the investigator had included of Elizabeth. Grainy, taken from a distance. Her profile as she walked into the hospital. The resemblance was there, in the jawline, the way she carried herself, that unconscious tilt of the head. But there was something else. Something that made Robert's chest tighten, with a feeling he couldn't name. The next day, he heard it. Elizabeth was in the hallway, humming while she organized medication supplies. A simple melody. Repetitive. Unconscious. Robert froze. His mother used to hum that exact tune. Margaret Stevens, dead 12 years now. She'd hum it while reading, while cooking, while doing absolutely nothing. A nervous habit, a comfort. Robert had never heard anyone else hum it. Not in 12 years. Until now. He stood there, listening, and felt the world rearrange itself around him. Here's what you need to understand about this moment. Robert wasn't a villain. He was a man, realizing he'd made a choice 17 years ago that cost him everything that mattered. We've all made decisions we'd give anything to undo. This story gets more complicated before it gets clearer. If you're invested in seeing how this unfolds, how Angel and Robert finally face each other, how Elizabeth learns the truth, hit that like button. It tells us you want the full story. And trust me, you do. That night, Robert stood outside his father's room at midnight, phone in hand. The DNA test kit he'd ordered sat in his car. He told himself it was for medical reasons, estate planning, practical concerns. But that was a lie. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He was looking at a teenage girl who had his mother's smile, his father's eyes, and every unconscious mannerism he saw in the mirror. A girl who hummed songs she shouldn't know. A girl whose mother had vanished the same summer his son had come home heartbroken. A girl who was 16 years old. And if he was right about who Angel really was, if Alma and Angel were the same person, then everything he'd built his life on was about to collapse, because it would mean his sons had left more than memories behind in Maine. He'd left a daughter, Robert's great-granddaughter, the one Gary's failing mind had recognized immediately, the one Robert had unknowingly turned away 17 years ago with a single phone call. But he still didn't know the full truth, and when he found out, it would destroy him. Robert pressed send on the email to the lab. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. The DNA test would tell him what his heart already knew. And then there would be no more running from the truth, for any of them. The DNA test Robert ordered wasn't meant to confirm paternity. It was meant to prove he was wrong. He needed to be wrong. Needed Elizabeth to be some random girl whose resemblance to his family was just like coincidence. Needed Angel to be exactly who she claimed, a caregiver with no connection to his past. Needed his instincts to be paranoia, born from grief, and too many sleepless nights. But the universe doesn't let you escape consequences, and Robert's were coming. He rehearsed the request a dozen times before 9 a.m. Casual, medical, nothing to raise suspicion. "We're updating Gary's medical records," Robert said that morning, finding Angel and Elizabeth in the kitchen. Family history, genetic markers, standard protocol for his treatment plan. "We'll need a sample from everyone who's been in close contact. Just a cheek swab." Angel's eyes met his. She knew. Not the details, maybe, but she knew this wasn't standard protocol. "Of course," she said slowly. "Whatever helps Mr. Stevens." Elizabeth looked up from her cereal, completely innocent. "Sure, if it helps Mr. Stevens," she said with a shrug. "Do we just, swab our mouths or something?" Robert's chest tightened at how easy it was. How trusting. This girl who had every reason to question the world had somehow remained open to it. "The nurse will be by this afternoon," he said. "Won't take more than a minute." Angel's hands were shaking when she set down her coffee cup. Robert saw it, pretended he didn't. What that test revealed would shatter 3 lives in ways no one saw coming. The next 72 hours moved like honey. Robert found himself at the hospital more than usual. Not in board meetings or on conference calls, but in his father's suite, watching. He brought Elizabeth books, nothing expensive, just things he thought she might like, based on what he'd seen on her bedside table. A mystery novel, a collection of short stories, a biography of Jane Goodall. "You didn't have to do this," Elizabeth said, eyes lighting up as she flipped through the Goodall book. "But thank you. I've wanted to read this forever." "You're interested in primates?" Robert asked, surprised. "I'm interested in women who didn't let anyone tell them what they couldn't do," Elizabeth said simply. Robert felt something crack in his chest. Over those 3 days, a tentative truce formed between Robert and Angel. They had actual conversations about caregiving, about difficult patients, about the small moments that made the work worth it. "You're good at this," Robert said one evening, watching Angel adjust Gary's pillows with practiced efficiency, at making him comfortable, at seeing him as a person, not just a patient. "Everyone deserves to be seen," Angel said, especially at the end. They didn't talk about the past, didn't talk about Maine or Summers or sons who were gone. It was almost normal, almost healing. And Gary was different when Elizabeth was near. His condition stabilized. The confusion cleared more often. The angry outbursts that had become common in recent months disappeared entirely. There was one moment, on the second day, that felt like something Robert had been missing his whole life without knowing it. Elizabeth was reading to Gary. Robert had stopped by during lunch, intending to stay 5 minutes. He stayed an hour. Angel brought them all sandwiches. They ate together in Gary's room. This old man, this powerful CEO, this teenage girl who knew nothing about her father, and the woman who held all their secrets. It felt like family. "Tell me about when you were young," Elizabeth said to Gary, setting down her book. "What were you like?" Gary's eyes cleared. He looked at Robert, really looked at him. "I was ambitious," Gary said slowly. "Too ambitious. I thought success was measured in buildings and board seats. I thought providing meant the same as loving." His gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "I taught my son that, and he taught his son. We passed down the wrong things." "It's not too late to pass down the right things," Elizabeth said gently. Robert felt tears prick his eyes. This girl, this impossible girl, was saying things he'd needed to hear for decades. Angel watched them together and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hope, dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, somehow, things could be okay. Let's talk about Elizabeth for a moment. Because while the adults were circling each other with secrets and suspicions, she was doing something no one expected. She was writing. Every night in her journal. A worn notebook she'd had since freshman year. Pages and pages about Gary. About how he reminded her of the grandfather she'd always wished she'd had. About Mr. Stevens the younger, and how sad he seemed, like someone who'd lost something they couldn't name. About her mom seeming different here, like she's remembering something she'd buried. May 3rd. Gary called me Little Star again today. Mom got this look on her face. Not angry, scared maybe? I asked her later what Estelle meant, and she said star in French. How does he know my middle name? I never told him. May 5th, Mr. Stevens, Robert, brought me books. Actual good books, not random stuff. He asked about school and listened to my answer. Actually listened. I think he's lonely. I think his whole family is lonely, even surrounded by all this money. May 6th, Mom hummed today while folding laundry. I realized I was humming the same tune while reading to Gary. He started humming with me. It was weird, beautiful weird. Like we all knew the same song without knowing how. That moment, the humming, happened on the third day of waiting. Elizabeth had been reading, then stopped, started humming without realizing. Gary joined in immediately, perfectly harmonized. Then Angel, standing in the doorway with fresh linens, unconsciously added her voice. 3 generations, humming the same melody, not knowing why it felt like coming home. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in. Not violent, but steady. The kind of rain that makes everything feel smaller, more intimate. Elizabeth sat with Gary, watching water stream down the windows, and he told her stories. Your father was fearless, Gary said, his voice drifting between clarity and confusion. When he was young, before I taught him to be afraid. He wanted to be a teacher. Did you know that? Not a businessman, a teacher. Elizabeth didn't correct him. What changed? I did, Gary said sadly. I told him dreams didn't pay the bills. I told him responsibility mattered more than happiness. His hand found hers. Don't let anyone tell you that, little star. Dreams matter, happiness matters. Love matters most of all. Robert sat in various waiting rooms during those 72 hours, pretending to work. The coffee rings accumulated on the table beside him, markers of his anxiety. 3 cups Tuesday, 4 Wednesday, 5 Thursday. Each hour feeling longer than the last. Angel folded and refolded the same blanket in Gary's room, hands moving on autopilot while her mind raced. She had nothing to hide, she told herself. She didn't know who James Stevens was when she knew him. Didn't know about this family, this empire. The test would show nothing because there was nothing to show. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The email arrived at 11:34 p.m. on Thursday. Robert was alone in his office, 43 floors above a city that suddenly felt irrelevant. The subject line read, "Genetic Analysis Results, Stevens, Reyes." He stared at it for a full minute before opening it. His eyes scanned the technical language. Markers, alleles, probability calculations. Then he found the conclusion. Probability of paternity, Robert Stevens, Elizabeth Reyes, 0.0%. His breath released. He'd been wrong. Thank God he'd been... His eyes caught the next line. Probability of great-grandparent relationship, Gary Stevens and Elizabeth Reyes, 99.9%. The world stopped. Robert read it again, then a third time. Grandparent relationship, 0.9%. He wasn't Elizabeth's father. He was her grandfather, which meant Elizabeth wasn't Gary's daughter. She was his great-granddaughter. His hands went numb. The phone slipped, clattered on the desk, which meant his father's dementia wasn't creating delusions. His father had somehow recognized his own great-great-granddaughter. Not great-granddaughter, great-great-granddaughter, which meant Elizabeth's real father was Robert's. Breath stopped. His son, James. The report fell from his hands. James had a daughter, had gotten Alma pregnant that summer, had died 2 years later, never knowing. And Robert had been the one who called the resort, who told them James wouldn't be returning, who sent his son home and severed the connection to the girl he loved. Robert had unknowingly abandoned his own great-granddaughter 17 years ago, and she'd been here the whole time, taking care of her great-grandfather, giving comfort to the family who'd thrown her mother away. The room tilted. Everything he'd built his life on was about to collapse. When Robert finally showed Angel the DNA results, she didn't cry. She laughed. And that's when he knew he'd lost more than he could ever get back. It was 1 a.m. Robert had texted Angel an hour earlier. "We need to talk. Now. My office." She'd known this was coming, had felt it building like pressure before a storm. Still, when she walked into his office and saw him sitting there, tie gone, shirt wrinkled, eyes hollow, she felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. The only light came from the desk lamp, casting shadows that made truth look like horror. The DNA report sat between them on the mahogany desk, corners already bent from Robert's grip. "Sit down," Robert said quietly. "I'd rather stand." "Angel." "Just say it," she interrupted. "Whatever you need to say, just say it." Robert slid the report across the desk. Angel didn't touch it. She just looked at him, waiting. "Elizabeth is my great-granddaughter," Robert said. Each word felt like pulling glass from a wound. "Not my daughter. My great-granddaughter. Which means her father was your son," Angel finished, her voice brittle as winter glass. The laugh came then, not hysterical, bitter. The sound of someone who'd just realized the cosmic joke they'd been living. "You think I knew," Angel said, still laughing. "You think I would have lived 16 years in silence if I knew you people existed?" Robert stood, came around the desk. "I didn't say." "Rob," Angel said, using the name his son had gone by, and Robert flinched. That's what he called himself. Just Rob. No last name, no family history. We spent 3 months together, and I didn't know he was James Robert Stevens, heir to a billion-dollar empire. I thought he was just a rich kid on vacation. Robert's face went pale. "James, You were with James. I was with Rob, Angel corrected. A boy who said he wanted to be a teacher, who hated business school, who promised me forever, and then disappeared like I'd been a summer hobby. Her voice cracked. I didn't know his real name until I found his watch. The engraving said, "To James." I didn't know he was your son until 30 seconds ago when you said, "great-granddaughter." Robert sank into his chair like his legs wouldn't hold him. He died, Robert said hoarsely. In 2010. Car accident. He was 23. The room went silent. Angel's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the desk. Dead? The word came out small, broken. I'm sorry, Robert whispered. I thought you knew. You thought what? Angel's voice rose. You thought I abandoned your son? That I took his child and ran? I didn't even know I was pregnant until he was gone. I called. For weeks. The number was disconnected. I went to the resort. They said James Stevens had checked out, left no forwarding information, and I should stop bothering them. Robert's head snapped up. What did you say? I said I went to... No, the name. What name did they use? James Stevens. They said... Angel stopped, stared at him. That was you. You called them. You're the one who told them James wouldn't be coming back. Robert couldn't meet her eyes. The truth settled between them like a living thing. Robert had sent his son to that resort, told him to sow wild oats before settling into the family business. He'd encouraged the recklessness that led to Angel, then pulled his son home with zero thought of consequences. He'd destroyed Angel's life with a single phone call 17 years ago, and he didn't even remember making it. I was protecting him, Robert said finally. He called me, said he'd met someone, said he was thinking about staying in Maine, forgetting business school. I told him to come home, to be responsible, to... His voice broke. To stop being a child. He wasn't being a child, Angel said, tears finally coming. He was being in love. And you took that from him. From both of us. Robert looked at the report again, at the name printed at the top. Elizabeth Marie Reyes. Elizabeth, he said slowly. That was my mother's middle name. Margaret Elizabeth Stevens. Angel's tears fell faster now. I know, he told me. He said his mother was the kindest person he'd ever known. That if we ever had a daughter, he wanted to name her Elizabeth. She wiped her face roughly. You want to know the worst part? I named her Elizabeth because he said it was his mother's name. Your mother. I gave my daughter a piece of the family that threw me away. We didn't know you existed, Robert said. You didn't want to know, Angel shot back. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Robert stood, walked to the window. 43 floors below, the city glittered, indifferent to the wreckage happening in this room. James tried to find you, Robert said quietly. After he came home, he was different, distant, angry. He asked me to help him locate you. I told him to move on. That you, were probably already involved with someone else. That summer romances weren't meant to last. Angel made a sound like a wounded animal. He listened to me, Robert continued. He went to business school, started working for the company, but he was never the same. And in 2010, he was driving back from a business meeting in Boston. It was raining. His car, hydroplaned. Robert's reflection in the window showed tears streaming down his face. The police said he was probably going too fast, distracted. I always wondered what he was thinking about in those last moments. He was thinking about us, Angel whispered, about the life you wouldn't let him have. Robert turned. How do you know? Angel pulled something from her pocket. A watch, worn leather strap, face frozen at 6:47 a.m. Because he left this behind, she said. and because I know what it feels like to lose everything in one morning. This is the moment everything breaks open. When the secrets we keep to protect ourselves end up hurting us more than the truth ever could. How many of us carry stories like this? Not this specific situation, maybe, but secrets about family, about choices, about the people we used to be? If this is hitting you hard, drop a comment. Just a word, an emoji, anything. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in the weight we carry. The story isn't over, but this moment, this confrontation, changes everything that comes next. Robert and Angel sat in silence for a long time. The city outside moved on. The world kept turning. But in this office, time felt suspended. "She's brilliant," Robert said finally. "Elizabeth, she's kind and brave, and everything James could have been if I hadn't." He stopped. "Everything he was before I killed it in him." "You didn't kill him," Angel said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Didn't I?" Robert met her eyes. "I taught him that duty mattered more than love. That family legacy was worth more than personal happiness. I made him choose between you and us. And when he tried to go back, I stopped him." He picked up a photo from his desk. James at graduation, smiling but not reaching his eyes. He died never knowing he had a daughter, never knowing he was going to be a father, because of me. Angel's hands trembled. She looked at the DNA report, at the clinical language that rewrote her entire history. "My daughter is the great-granddaughter of a billionaire," she said slowly. "The daughter of a dead man she barely knew existed. The great-great-granddaughter of the man she's been caring for." She looked up at Robert. "How do we tell her this?" "We have to tell her," Robert said finally. Angel looked at him like he'd suggested setting the world on fire. "Tell her what? That her father's dead? That you're her grandfather? That she's heir to a fortune? That she's been taking care of her own great-grandfather without knowing it?" Her voice cracked. "You tell her that, and you destroy the only peace she's ever known. We can't keep this from her. Watch me." Angel stood to leave. Robert's next words stopped her cold. "Gary knows. His dementia isn't hiding the truth. It's revealing it. And eventually, Elizabeth will ask him the right question. And he'll answer." Angel's hand froze on the doorknob. They both knew he was right. Gary had been calling Elizabeth his great-granddaughter, technically great-great-granddaughter, from the beginning. His broken mind had seen what their whole minds couldn't. He'd recognized James in her face, Margaret in her mannerisms, the family resemblance that went deeper than genetics. "How long?" Angel asked, not turning around. "How long what?" "How long do we have before she figures it out herself?" Robert looked at the report, at the truth they could no longer bury. "Not long," he said. "Not long at all." But telling Elizabeth would risk destroying the only stable family she'd ever known. And neither of them was ready for that conversation. Not yet. It took Elizabeth 3 days to ask the question that would change her life forever. 3 days of watching her mother and Robert move around each other like planets in careful orbit, never colliding, always aware. 3 days of noticing how Angel's hands shook when she poured coffee, how Robert's eyes followed Elizabeth with something that looked like grief, how the air in Gary's suite felt heavy with words nobody was saying. Elizabeth wasn't stupid. She'd spent 16 years reading rooms, sensing tension, knowing when adults were lying to protect her. And these adults were definitely lying. The curiosity started small. Why did Gary keep calling her my little star? Why did that name make her mother freeze every single time? Why did Robert bring her books and then look at her like he was trying to memorize her face? Then she found the photograph. It was tucked inside an old medical journal, on Gary's bookshelf. The kind of hiding place that wasn't really hiding, just forgotten. Elizabeth had been looking for something to read to Gary when the photo slipped out and fell to the floor. She picked it up. The image was old. Colors faded to that particular amber tone of the late 1980s. A young Gary Stevens, she recognized him from other photos around the suite, stood beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes. Between them, a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed joy. Elizabeth flipped it over, handwriting on the back, elegant and fading. Gary, Margaret, and James. Summer 1989. James. The name Gary had said. You remind me of my son, James. Elizabeth's heart started beating faster. She looked at the boy in the photo. Really looked at the shape of his smile. The way his head tilted slightly to the left. The deep-set eyes that looked back at her like a mirror. Who do I remind you of? Elizabeth asked Gary that evening. She was sitting beside his bed, the photo hidden in her pocket, burning like a secret. Gary turned his head slowly. His eyes were clear. One of those moments when the fog lifted and he was completely present. You remind me of my son, James, he said, his voice steady. He had your spirit. That same kindness. That same stubbornness about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Elizabeth's breath caught. What happened to James? He died, Gary said simply. Too young, 23 years old. He'd just started to figure out who he was, and then he was gone. Tears slipped down Gary's weathered cheeks. He fell in love once, that summer before everything went wrong. I never met her, but I saw his face when he talked about her. He was happy, really happy. Then my son, Robert, made him come home, made him give her up. And James was never the same. Elizabeth sat very still. When was this? When did James fall in love? Summer of 2008, Gary said. He called her his star, said she shined brighter than anyone he'd ever known. The room tilted. Elizabeth's middle name, Estelle. Star. Summer of 2008. 9 months before her birth in February 2009. James Robert Stevens, Rob. That night, after Gary fell asleep, Elizabeth took her phone to her room and started searching. James Robert Stevens obituary. The articles came up immediately. Heir to Stevens Industries. Died in car accident, March 2010. Survived by father Robert Stevens and grandfather Gary Stevens. Memorial service private. She found photos. James at his college graduation. James at a charity gala. James in a candid shot, laughing at something off camera. His head tilted left just like hers. Elizabeth pulled up her own birth certificate photo. The one she'd needed for her driver's license. February 12th, 2009. Mother, Angel Maria Reyes. Father, unknown. The math was simple, devastating, undeniable. Her realization was done alone, in silence. No dramatic music, no witnesses, just a 16-year-old girl sitting on her bed, looking at photos of a dead man who had her eyes, understanding that her entire life had been built on a loss she never knew existed. She didn't cry, not yet. She was too busy rearranging her entire history in her mind. The next morning, Elizabeth found Angel in the kitchen. "Mom," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Angel's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. She knew. Elizabeth could see it in her face, the recognition that the secret was over. They went to Angel's room. Elizabeth closed the door. The afternoon light came through the window, golden and strange. In the background, barely audible, Gary's heart monitor beeped steadily, grounding. Elizabeth sat on the bed. Her hands were perfectly still. Angel's shook. "Did you know about them?" Elizabeth asked. Not accusing, just seeking truth, like a scientist rather than a victim. "No," Angel said immediately. "Not until a few days ago." "Did you know his real name?" "Not until this week. He told me his name was Rob, Just Rob. Elizabeth nodded slowly, processing. He's my father. James, isn't he? Angel's face crumpled. Yes. And he died in 2010. Yes. Did he know about me? No, Angel whispered. I didn't even know I was pregnant until after he was gone. I tried to find him. I called. I went back to the resort. They said he'd checked out. No forwarding information. Her voice broke. I thought he'd abandoned me. I didn't know he was dead until Robert told me. Robert, Elizabeth repeated. Robert is your grandfather. The words hung in the air between them. Elizabeth wasn't angry. That's what broke Angel's heart later. She was just sad. Sad for the father she never knew. Sad for the mother who carried this alone. Sad for the years they'd spent surviving when they could have been living. Would you have told me if you did? Elizabeth asked. If you'd known about them? Angel opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was complicated. I don't know, she finally said. Elizabeth nodded. That answer, at least, felt true. Gary knew, Elizabeth said. His dementia. It's not making him confused. He actually recognizes me, because I'm his great-great-granddaughter. Yes. They sat in silence. The monitor beeped. The light shifted. The truth settled into the space between them like a third person. Elizabeth did something in this moment that most of us forget how to do. She chose understanding over anger. She looked at her mother, this woman who'd worked double shifts and skipped meals and built a life from nothing, and she chose grace. That's rare. That's the kind of character that gets built through hardship, not privilege. If you've made it this far into this story, you're invested in these people. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about family, truth, and second chances. These stories matter, and sharing them means more people get to feel less alone. You did the best you could, Elizabeth said finally, with what you knew, with what you had. Angel's tears came then, years of them, 17 years of holding everything together, and now her daughter, this impossible, graceful daughter, was giving her permission to break. I'm so sorry, Angel sobbed. I'm sorry you grew up without a father. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more. I'm sorry, Mom. Elizabeth moved to sit beside her, wrapped her arms around her. You gave me everything. You gave me you. That was enough. That will always be enough. They held each other as the sun set outside, as Gary slept peacefully down the hall, as the weight of secrets finally lifted. After a long time, Elizabeth pulled back. I want to meet him, she said. Angel's confusion showed. Meet who, honey? Your father's. My grandfather, Robert, officially. Not as his father's caregiver's daughter. As his great-granddaughter. Angel's breath caught. Elizabeth, this family is complicated. Every family's complicated, Mom. Elizabeth stood, suddenly looking older than 16. The difference is, this one wants us. For the first time in my life, I have family who knows I exist. I'm not letting that go. But Elizabeth's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. And what she decided to do next would either heal this family or break it forever. Robert Stevens had hosted presidential dinners and board meetings with hostile takeovers on the line. None of them terrified him like dinner with his great-granddaughter. He'd arranged everything at his penthouse, 43 floors above the city, floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing a view that usually impressed everyone. Tonight, it just made him feel exposed. The apartment was opulent but sterile. Modern furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Art that belonged in museums. Everything perfect and untouched and lonely. Robert realized, looking around, that nothing in this space felt lived in. It was a showcase, not a home. Elizabeth arrived with Angel at 7 p.m. She wore jeans and a simple sweater. No attempt to dress up for wealth. Robert appreciated that more than he could say. "This is beautiful," Elizabeth said, walking to the windows. But her tone suggested she was being polite rather than impressed. "Thank you," Robert said awkwardly. "Please, sit. Dinner is ready." They arranged themselves around a table that could seat 12. 3 people at one end, mountains of empty space around them. The chef had prepared everything perfectly. Perfectly untouched food on expensive china. Nobody seemed hungry. Robert's attempts to connect with Elizabeth were painful to watch. Even he knew it. "So school," he started. "You're, what grade?" "Junior," Elizabeth said. "11th grade." "Right, and you like it?" "It's school." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "I like learning. The social part is harder." Robert nodded, understanding that more than she knew. "I was the same way. Books made more sense than people." A small connection. Elizabeth's smile warmed slightly. "Can I ask about him?" Elizabeth said suddenly. "About my father? About James?" Robert's hands trembled. He set down his fork. "Of course," he said. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Elizabeth said simply. "I want to know everything." So Robert told her. He told her about James's rebellious phase at 14, when he'd dyed his hair blue and gotten detention for arguing with a history teacher about economic inequality. About how James had wanted to be a teacher, not a businessman. About his laughter, loud and uncontrolled and infectious. About his dreams, before the family business consumed them. "He was kind," Robert said, his voice thick. "Genuinely kind, in a way that's rare in our world. He volunteered at a soup kitchen every Saturday, refused security, said he wanted to meet people, not as the Stevens heir." Elizabeth's eyes shone. "He sounds amazing." "He was," Robert said, "and I destroyed that in him, piece by piece. I taught him that duty mattered more than joy, that the family legacy was more important than his own happiness, that love was a distraction from responsibility." The room went quiet. "That summer, 2008, he called me from Maine," Robert continued. "Said he'd met someone. Said she made him remember who he wanted to be. Said he was thinking about staying, forgetting business school, building a different life." Robert's voice cracked. "And I told him to come home. Told him to stop being childish. Told him that girl, your mother, was just a summer distraction." Angel flinched. Elizabeth reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "He came home," Robert said, "like I told him to, and he was never the same. The light in him just went out. And in 2010, driving too fast in the rain, maybe distracted, maybe just tired of living the life I'd chosen for him." Robert stopped, couldn't finish. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly, "for your loss, for his loss, for all of it." Robert looked at this teenage girl, his great-granddaughter, and saw everything his son could have been if he'd had the freedom to choose love over legacy. Elizabeth had been raised with nothing except what Angel could provide. And somehow, she'd become more complete than Robert had ever been with everything. "I'm the one who should apologize," Robert said. He stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside Elizabeth's chair. "To both of you. I destroyed your chance at a family. I took James from both of you. I made choices that hurt people I never even knew existed. And I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I'm sorry." Angel's walls finally crumbled. Years of anger, of survival mode, of protecting herself, all of it dissolved, watching this powerful man kneel before her daughter and take responsibility for his mistakes. "We can't change the past," Angel said, tears streaming. "But maybe we can change what happens next." Elizabeth looked between them. Then she asked the question that changed everything. How much time does he have? Robert knew she meant Gary. Not much, he said honestly. Days, maybe. Weeks, if we're lucky. Elizabeth stood decisively. Then I want him to know the truth before he goes. Angel's face went pale. Elizabeth, what if it's too much for his heart? What if not knowing breaks it? Robert countered gently. Elizabeth looked at both of them with wisdom beyond her 16 years. He already knows. He's been trying to tell us the whole time. Now I need you to understand something about Gary's dementia. It hadn't stolen his mind. It had freed it from the social filters we all carry. He recognized Elizabeth because his heart knew her before his brain could question it. That's not confusion. That's clarity we've forgotten how to access. He called me his great-granddaughter weeks ago, Elizabeth continued. He's been saying it all along. We're the ones who weren't listening. Robert and Angel exchanged looks. She was right. We tell him together, Elizabeth said, as a family. That word, family, hung in the air. The first time the three of them had claimed it out loud. Robert showed Elizabeth photos then. Albums he'd pulled from storage. James as a baby, James at 10, James at 20, right before that fateful summer. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. Elizabeth laughed at one photo, James covered in paint after helping renovate a community center. That laughter echoed through Robert's penthouse, filling spaces that had been silent for over a decade. It was the first time that sound had filled his home in years, and Robert felt something crack open in his chest. The Mom City lights sparkled behind them, 43 floors up, the world distant and small. But in this moment, in this room, everything that mattered was right here. They returned to Gary's room together at 9 p.m., the three of them. Angel, Robert, Elizabeth. Gary was awake, propped up on pillows. His eyes were tired but present. The monitors beeped softly. The room smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne and something else, the particular scent of time running out. He smiled when Elizabeth entered. That same smile he'd been giving her for weeks. Recognition without question. "My little star," he whispered. Elizabeth walked to his bedside. She looked back once at Angel and Robert, who nodded encouragement. Then she sat beside Gary and took his weathered hand in her young one. "Grandpa Gary," she said clearly, "it's me, Elizabeth, your great-great-granddaughter." Gary's eyes filled with tears. His grip on her hand tightened. For a moment, perfect clarity crossed his face. The kind that happens sometimes near the end, when the fog lifts completely and the person you knew comes back one last time. "I knew," he breathed. "I knew you'd come home." "I'm here," Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face. "James's daughter, I'm here." "You have his heart," Gary said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "His kindness, his light, everything we tried to extinguish in him, it survived in you." Robert stepped forward, hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "Dad, I'm sorry. For James. For all of it." Gary looked at his son. "You get a second chance now. Don't waste it the way I wasted mine." The four of them stayed there. 3 generations bound by blood and mistakes and the possibility of redemption. Gary held Elizabeth's hand. Robert held Elizabeth's shoulder. Angel stood behind them all, witnessing the family she never knew she was always meant to be part of. "Tell me about your life," Gary said to Elizabeth. "Tell me everything." And she did. She talked about school and books and her dreams of medical school. She talked about growing up with just her mother, about the love they'd built from nothing. She talked about finding him, about this impossible, beautiful moment they were sharing. Gary listened to every word, his eyes never leaving her face, committing her to memory in whatever time he had left. Outside, the city moved on. Inside this room, a family finally became whole. Gary Stevens had one last moment of perfect clarity, and he used it to give his family what they'd never had: truth. The morning after the revelation, Angel arrived at Gary's suite at 6 a.m. expecting to find him asleep. Instead, he was sitting up in bed, eyes bright, fully alert. Not the clouded confusion of dementia, complete presence. "Good morning, Angel," he said clearly. Or should I say, Alma. Angel froze in the doorway. Gary smiled gently. "James wrote to me that summer. Letters I kept hidden from Robert. He told me about you, about the girl who made him remember how to dream." It was a surge, the medical term for that unexpected burst of energy and clarity that sometimes happens before the end. Angel had seen it before in other patients. The body's final gift. 4 hours, maybe 5, of the person you knew coming back completely before they slip away forever. "Call everyone," Gary said. "I don't have much time. And I have things I need to say." Within the hour, they were all gathered in Gary's room. Angel, Robert, Elizabeth, and Maria, the night nurse who'd been with them through everything, who'd become part of this impossible story. Gary's voice was strong for the first time in months. His words came clear and purposeful. "James kept a journal that summer," Gary began. "I found it after he died. He wrote about you, Alma. About how you worked 3 jobs and still had kindness left over for everyone you met. About how you made him want to be better than what we'd raised him to be." Angel's hands trembled. Robert stood rigid, listening to things he'd never known about his own son. "He was going to go back," Gary continued. "In 2010, the day he died, he was driving to Maine. Not to a business meeting. To you. He'd finally found the courage to defy us, to choose his own life. And Gary's voice cracked. "I called him during that drive. Told him he was throwing his life away. Told him to turn around. We argued, and then the line went dead." The room went silent except for the steady beep of monitors. "The accident happened minutes after our call," Gary said. "I've carried that for 15 years, wondering if my last words to my grandson were what distracted him, what killed him." Robert made a sound like he'd been struck. "You were the one who made him happy," Gary said, looking at Angel. "I saw it in his letters. I just didn't value happiness over legacy. I taught Robert the same poison. That success, measured in dollars, mattered more than success measured in love." "I didn't know," Angel whispered. "I thought he abandoned me." "He was coming back to you," Gary said. "He never stopped loving you. And he never knew." His eyes found Elizabeth. "He never knew about the most beautiful thing he'd ever created." Elizabeth sat beside Gary, holding his hand. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying from finally understanding where she came from. "That melody you hum," Gary said to Elizabeth. "Do you know where you learned it?" Elizabeth shook her head. "It was Margaret's lullaby. James's mother, my wife. She hummed it constantly. James must have hummed it around your mother when she was pregnant. Music travels like that, through generations, through love." Angel gasped. "I hummed it to Elizabeth when she was a baby. I didn't know why. It felt right." "And Little Star," Gary continued. "I called Margaret that. James called you that, Alma. And somehow when Elizabeth walked into my room, my heart recognized the pattern. The love passing down. The pieces were falling into place. All the strange connections. All the moments of recognition that felt like more than coincidence." Gary turned to Robert. "I taught you that love was weakness," he said. "That showing emotion was unprofessional. That legacy mattered more than relationship. I'm sorry, son. I destroyed your marriage teaching you that. I destroyed James teaching him that. Don't let me destroy what you could have with Elizabeth." I won't, Robert promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do better than you did. Better than I did. Angel, Gary said, I know I have no right to ask this, but can you forgive an old man who valued the wrong things? Angel stepped forward. She took Gary's other hand. You didn't know. None of us knew. But we know now. And yes, I forgive you. Gary's tears fell freely. Thank you. Then he looked at Elizabeth. Really looked at her. The afternoon light that day had a particular quality. The nurses would say later they'd never seen that room so bright. Like something holy was happening. 4 generations of hands linked together. Gary's aged hand, weathered and spotted with time. Robert's strong hand, powerful CEO hands that built empires. Angel's trembling hand, working-class hands that had survived everything. Elizabeth's young hand, smooth and hopeful and full of future. All connected. You have his heart, Gary said to Elizabeth. James's heart. Don't waste it like we did. Don't let anyone tell you that duty matters more than love. Don't let anyone steal your dreams in the name of responsibility. Promise me. I promise, Elizabeth said. Gary smiled. You're the second chance I don't deserve. The piece of him that survived. Thank you for letting an old fool pretend he got everything right in the end. You didn't pretend, Elizabeth said. You saw the truth when everyone else was blind to it. Your heart knew me before your brain could question it. That's not foolishness. That's wisdom. They stayed like that for hours. Gary told stories about James that Robert had never heard. About the grandson who volunteered at homeless shelters, who argued with his grandfather about wealth inequality, who wanted to change the world, not just profit from it. Robert learned things about his own son that he'd been too busy building an empire to notice. Angel learned that the boy she loved had never stopped loving her. Elizabeth learned that she came from people who made mistakes, but also from people capable of profound love. Maria stood quietly in the corner, witnessing this family knit itself back together in the shadow of death. At 6:47 p.m., the exact time frozen on James's watch, the time he'd left Angel all those years ago, Gary squeezed Elizabeth's hand one last time. You're home now, he said. All of you. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed. He never woke up again. They stayed with him through the night, taking turns holding his hand, telling him stories, thanking him for the gift of these final hours. Gary Stevens passed peacefully at 3:22 a.m. with his family around him. Not the family he'd built through business and legacy. The family he'd found through a great-granddaughter he never knew existed. A caregiver who should have been his daughter-in-law. A son who finally understood what mattered. In the end, his broken mind had healed what his whole mind had destroyed. 3 months after Gary's funeral, Angel got a phone call that proved some endings are actually beginnings. But first, the funeral. Elizabeth had insisted on speaking. At 16 years old, standing before 200 people in a cathedral that felt more like a museum than a place of worship, she delivered a eulogy that left no dry eyes. I knew Gary Stevens for 47 days, she'd said, her voice steady and clear. Most of you knew him for decades. You knew the businessman, the philanthropist, the patriarch. I knew the great-grandfather who called me Little Star, who recognized me when I didn't even recognize myself, who taught me that sometimes broken things see more clearly than whole ones. He gave me the greatest gift anyone can give. He gave me my history, my father, my family. He gave me belonging. And he did it all while his mind was supposedly failing him. She'd paused, looked at the ornate casket. His mind didn't fail. It freed him to love without conditions, to recognize truth without needing proof, to build a family based on heart instead of paperwork. I only had him for 47 days, but those days gave me a lifetime of knowing where I come from. Thank you, Grandpa Gary, for seeing me, for knowing me, for coming home." The will reading came a week later in Robert's office. The lawyer, Robert, Angel, Elizabeth, and Maria, who Gary had specifically requested be present. The provisions were generous, but expected. Elizabeth's education fully funded. A trust fund that would give her security without excess. Inheritance that recognized her as family. But then the lawyer pulled out a letter, handwritten, dated the day of Gary's final clarity. "Mr. Stevens requested this be read aloud," the lawyer said. Robert nodded, unable to speak. The lawyer began, "To my family, the one I found at the end. James kept a box of letters in his room. After he died, I read them all. Every word he wrote about Alma. About how she worked sunrise to sunset and still found energy to make others laugh. About how she dreamed of being a nurse, of helping people. About how she made him believe in versions of himself we'd told him didn't matter. He wrote that he was going to marry her. That he was going to leave the business, become a teacher, like he'd always wanted, and build a life based on what mattered. He wrote that she was pregnant. He'd found out the day before the accident. He was driving to her, not away. He was choosing love. I never told Robert this. I was ashamed. Ashamed that my grandson died, choosing the very things I'd taught him to reject. Alma, Angel, you didn't abandon him. He didn't abandon you. We took him from you. And then fate took him from all of us. Elizabeth, you are proof that love survives even death. You are your father's legacy, not the business empire, not the wealth, but the kindness and courage he tried so hard to hold on to. Robert, be the grandfather I failed to be. Be the father I failed to teach you to be. And all of you, be family, the real kind, the choosing kind. With love and regret, Gary." Angel's grief finally released then. 17 years of thinking she'd been abandoned, of believing she hadn't been enough, of carrying the weight alone, it all poured out. James had been coming back. He'd known about their baby. He'd chosen them. Robert held her while she cried. This woman his son had loved. This woman who should have been his daughter-in-law. "I'll be the grandfather she deserves," he promised, "and the father-in-law my son would have wanted you to have." 6 months later, life looked different. Elizabeth attended private school now. Robert's insistence, Angel's reluctant agreement. But Elizabeth remained unchanged by wealth. Still kind, still humble. Still the girl who volunteered at homeless shelters on weekends and treated everyone like they mattered. Angel ran the Gary Stevens Memorial Hospice Care Center, a new wing Robert had funded in his father's name. She specialized in dementia patients and family reunification cases, helping other families find each other before it was too late. Every Wednesday, they had family dinner. Robert, Angel, Elizabeth, Maria, who'd become an honorary member of this impossible family. They'd gather at Robert's penthouse, though it felt less sterile now. Elizabeth's textbooks on the coffee table, Angel's cardigan on the couch. Photos of James finally displayed instead of hidden. "I want to start a foundation," Elizabeth said one Wednesday, passing the salad, "in my father's name, for kids who want to be teachers but can't afford education." Robert smiled. I think that's exactly what he would have wanted. He was teaching Elizabeth about the business, but on her terms, not grooming her to take over, showing her the tools so she could choose her own path, breaking the cycle that had destroyed James. The phone call came on a Tuesday. "Is this Angel Reyes?" a woman's voice asked, hesitant, hopeful. "Yes." "My name is Sarah Stevens. I was James's sister." Angel's heart stopped. "I've been estranged from my father for 8 years," Sarah continued. We had a falling out about the business, about family expectations. But I heard about Elizabeth, about my niece. And I'd like to meet her, if that's okay. Another branch of family, another chance at connection, another piece of James that survived. They met the following week. Sarah, 38, with James's eyes and Gary's determination and a warmth that had survived years of family dysfunction. She brought photo albums, pictures of James as a child that Robert had never shared, stories about a brother who'd protected her, encouraged her dreams, told her it was okay to want something different. "You look just like him," Sarah told Elizabeth, crying. "You have his spirit." The family grew, expanded, healed. This story started with a dying man calling a stranger his daughter. It ends with a family built not from blood alone, but from truth, grace, and second chances. Angel spent 17 years protecting Elizabeth from a past she thought would hurt her. But that past held belonging. Gary's dementia didn't steal his memory. It revealed the love that protocol and pride had hidden. Sometimes the things we're most afraid of are exactly what we need. If this story moved you, do 3 things. Subscribe, because we tell stories about real people facing impossible situations. Share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And comment below. Tell us about the family you found, the truth that freed you, or the second chance you're still waiting for. These stories matter because your stories matter. 1 year after Gary's death, Elizabeth visits his grave every Sunday. She brings flowers and tells him about medical school applications, about the foundation they're launching, about the family that keeps growing. The hospice wing, named for Gary, specializes in dementia care and family reunification. They've helped 17 families find each other so far. Robert funds DNA testing services for families separated by circumstance, helping other angels and Elizabeths find their way home. Elizabeth is pre-med, studying neurology. She wants to understand minds like Gary's, wants to help other families see that dementia doesn't always steal. Sometimes it reveals. She keeps a photo on her desk, the one Gary held during his last moments. James, at 21, standing on a beach in Maine, smiling at someone behind the camera, smiling at Angel, young and hopeful and in love. The first time Gary called Elizabeth "my little star," Angel nearly dropped the medication tray. She thought it was dementia, stealing names, and creating false memories. She was wrong. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Gary's broken mind saw what their whole minds couldn't. Family isn't about the stories we tell. It's about the truth we finally stop hiding from. And sometimes, the people we're hired to care for end up being the ones who save us.